No. Hello? Oh, there we go. Can you guys, am I on? I'm on. Good. Thank you. Good evening. I am Art Vandenhouten. I am the Interim Vice President for Academic Affairs, and it is my privilege to welcome you this evening to our Forum on Government and Public Policy. As many of you know, because I see some familiar faces in the audience, right, we were put on hold, of course, by the pandemic, and like everyone in the world, had to kind of come up with new ways to do things, did some things on Zoom, moved some things around. But we are, of course, now back on campus and back to our traditional format, and this is delightful to see sort of audiences kind of returning. I would, of course, like first to recognize Jim Tetman, who is the director of the Forum on Government and Public Policy, and is really instrumental to the success of this institution, you know, which is just really a great gift to the community and enriches the lives of the academic community at Flagler, but also the lives of our students, as every speaker, as you'll see tonight, spends time with our students. And of course, that is kind of one of the great things about this program. But equally important is the opportunity it gives us to have a dialogue with the community. So we are privileged tonight that our speaker is David Abel, and he is just what the 21st century calls for, truly a multitasking journalist. He's a podcaster, videographer, a photojournalist, Boston Globe reporter since 1999, and a flyer of drones since 2021. Now covering environmental issues, Abel has walked on top of a nuclear reactor, boarded ice-covered fishing boats before dawn in the black waters of Newfoundland, crossed the melting Arctic Sea on a snowmobile, and trekked across the mountains on Tierra del Fuego. He was part of the Boston Globe's Pulitzer Prize-winning team of reporters, photographers, and videographers covering the Boston Marathon in 2013. He's covered civil wars in Kosovo and Venezuela, lived in Mexico City, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and on the edge of the Everglades. For the past 5 years, he's focused on filmmaking, most recently a prize-winning film on the survival of the North Atlantic right whale, a project sponsored in part by the Pulitzer Center, which helped bring him to Flagler College. The Pulitzer Center is a most unusual institution, devoted to shedding light on underreported global issues, conflicts, developments, and trends. We at Flagler are fortunate to be one of 35 colleges and universities participating in the Pulitzer's unique college consortium, which encourages and inspires students reporting projects that have taken Flagler students to Honduras, Mexico, Costa Rica, the Arctic, and during the pandemic, to California and Brooklyn. Pulitzer also supported David Abel's reporting and the film we'll see parts of this evening. David Abel graduated from the University of Michigan, received a master's degree from Northwestern. He's taught journalism and writing classes at Harvard, Boston, Emerson, and Northeastern. He joins us tonight after what was a busy day with students and faculty on the campus of Flagler College. Won't you please join me in welcoming to St. Augustine and to Flagler College, David Abel. David. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. It's really a pleasure to be here after spending months in Arctic conditions in Boston. So this is an incredibly beautiful place to be and an especially beautiful campus. I have been wowed throughout the day here, just really inspired by the immense beauty of this campus. I'll just say for those who have attended the talk that I gave this morning, I just want to apologize for any repetition here. Hopefully there'll be some differences. You heard a little bit about my career. Over the past decade, I've been the environmental reporter at the Boston Globe, and I've done all sorts of crazy things, including you heard about my experience on the melting Arctic Sea, and as I was explaining to Jim as he was introducing me earlier, that it was really a matter of nearly sinking a snowmobile into the accelerating melt of the Arctic Ocean. Over the years, I've covered all kinds of things. Sadly, disastrous natural disasters like the horrific hurricanes that leveled much of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands after Hurricane Maria and Irma hit. I've reported in all kinds of places, including maximum security prisons, alligator-fueled swamps. I've trekked across the mountains of Tierra del Fuego and more recently fished with rogue lobstermen in Nova Scotia and managed to paddle through polluted rivers with toxic chemicals in Boston. Over the years, I've had a front row seat to many of the rapid changes we're experiencing in our climate, environment, and energy systems. Frankly, these days, little surprises me. But 2.5 years ago, I read a report by the United Nations that, frankly, floored me. It left me struggling to comprehend the enormity of its findings. This report found as many as 1 million species, both plants and animals, are now threatened with extinction, many of them within the coming decades. That report, which was produced by hundreds of scientists around the world, found that the average abundance of native plants and animals in the rainforests in South America and the savannas in Africa and other major land habitats have plummeted by at least 20% over the past century. The report projected that more than 40% of all amphibian species, more than 1/3 of all marine mammals, and 1/3 of reef-forming corals are also now at risk of extinction. In an interview I did with one of the authors of the report, he told me, "It's like we're unraveling our life support system." He noted that the loss of so much biodiversity would have a grave impact on food supplies, medicine, air quality, and much more. Another author of the report called the findings ominous. He said, "We're eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide." I wrote a story about that report that appeared on the front page of the Boston Globe right after it came out, but it just didn't feel sufficient. It didn't feel like it conveyed the full gravity or the scale of the findings. That story stuck with me, and I began to wonder, how do you possibly get anyone to appreciate such an overwhelming magnitude of loss? How could I help folks as a journalist understand that climate change, the ultimate cause of all this destruction to our biodiversity, was not some distant abstract threat, but one that presents a clear and present danger right now? Before I knew anything of climate change, before I'd become a journalist or knew what I wanted to do with my life, I was just out of college, broke, kind of a vagabond searching for identity on the streets of San Francisco. One day, between reading my inscrutable poems at poetry readings and struggling with an overwrought novel, I learned that a Russian ultranationalist by the name of Vladimir Zhirinovsky had come to town to speak. I didn't have that much better to do, so I decided I'd check it out. After his speech, which was filled with all kinds of racist, virulent bombast, I watched as a shaggy-haired man in an old blazer with elbow patches got up to ask a question. He called Zhirinovsky out for his rhetoric and asked questions that made him squirm. He was a reporter for the local newspaper. Around the same time, I was reading a novel called Immortality by the great Czech writer Milan Kundera. Kundera described what he called the 11th commandment. By that, he meant a right allowed to journalists in democratic countries, or what he called the right to demand an answer to a question. He wrote, "The journalist is not merely the one who asks, but the one who has the sacred right to ask to anyone about anything." He also called a question a bridge of understanding. That power, a kind of means to empathy and holding public officials account, really resonated with me. I started volunteering to write for a local newspaper, and a few months later, I moved to Chicago for a master's program in journalism, where I learned how to ground prose and write in short, to-the-point sentences that aimed to be anything but inscrutable, like much of my poetry at the time. At the end of the program, I moved to Mexico City, where I had been interning as a kind of Washington correspondent in Washington, D.C. And it was there that I had my first paying job as a newspaper reporter. Here's the story of my first day on the job and a sense of the stresses of what it meant to be a new reporter. For my first assignment, a paunchy editor who favored cigars and scotch for breakfast gave me an assignment. In a monotone growl and a swirl of smoke, he asked me to translate a story from Spanish into English, which was an assignment I was uniquely unqualified for, given that I was going on the Spanish I learned in high school. Before moving to Mexico, I was assured by the same editor that that would be enough to get by. So I spent the next hour bent over a Spanish-English dictionary. I knew something was wrong when the lead of my story read something like, "A frog in a rainbow Saturday morning planned to appoint an airplane as the nation's next attorney general." Needless to say, the sweat began to drip from my increasingly warm head. If there was one lesson I had picked up while studying journalism in grad school, one tenet of the craft that seemed to rise above all the others, it was that what you write has to be true, that facts matter. I began to feel dizzy. My computer seemed to be rocking back and forth, as did the cement building where I was sitting on the third floor. I was sure I was having a nervous breakdown. It was about that moment I noticed many of my colleagues were running for the door, and that someone was tapping me on the shoulder, urging me to follow her right away. It turned out a major earthquake had struck Mexico City, and I was too stressed out to realize it. As more seasoned colleagues sprang into action, I was just relieved I was able to get out of that assignment. I spent about a year learning the ropes of journalism in Mexico, which sometimes felt like a post-apocalyptic hellscape, given all the pollution there. I left Mexico to spend a few months running a pepper farm in a small mountain town in the Dominican Republic, but that's a pretty long story, which I'll avoid telling you. Afterward, I moved here to Florida, where I was hired by the Palm Beach Post to cover a small community on the edge of the Everglades, where I learned how human beings could radically transform such a wild landscape. After about a year of reporting down here, I was impatient to get back to Latin America. And when then Pope John Paul II visited Cuba in the late 90s, it seemed like there was something of a glasnost or an opening to do what I really wanted to do as a reporter. That was to give voice to the voiceless, to expose inequities, to shed light on the effects of authoritarianism in which no one has freedom of speech, people go to prison for criticizing the government, and poverty and despair were more pervasive than anything I had seen anywhere else. Over the next 6 months as a stringer for the Boston Globe, Miami Herald, San Francisco Chronicle, and other papers, I pushed my luck, writing increasingly critical stories about everything from dissident farmers to independent libraries. Eventually, the government had enough of my presence and they deported me. Over the next year, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I covered national security issues at the Pentagon and went to the former Yugoslavia to cover the war in Kosovo. The Globe eventually asked me to move to Boston to become a staff writer, and so I thought I'd give it a try. Since then, I've written thousands of stories for the paper, covering academia, poverty, terrorism, racism, and a pandemic. I've also covered some of the major stories of our times, including the deadlocked election here in Florida in 2000, the attacks on September 11th in New York, and the terrorism at the Boston Marathon. But no story has threaded through my career or been as important to me as how our environment has been changing and the impact it has across the planet. The first story in which I mentioned climate change or global warming for the Globe was way back in 2001, little more than a year after I started at the paper. It was a story I wrote shortly after Al Gore conceded to George W. Bush when the Supreme Court decided to stop the recount here in Palm Beach County. The story was about how Gore left politics and was teaching at Columbia University. After rereading the story recently, I realized that something had stuck with me from that piece. I remember Gore talking to his students about balance, or more specifically, false balance. Here's what I wrote back then. In the name of balance, the new professor told his students that journalists shouldn't give credit to discredited ideas. In writing a story about AIDS, for example, is it necessary to include someone questioning whether HIV produces AIDS, even though some still say it doesn't? More than a decade later, when I took over the environment beat at the Globe, I came to learn quickly that there really wasn't much of a sincere debate about whether humans were causing the planet to warm. Over that time, I realized that part of my mission as the Globe's environmental reporter was to reflect to readers that climate change was not some ideological point of view or some distant abstract idea, but that it was a fact, and that I had a responsibility as a reporter to point out the evidence, the warming temperatures, the rising tides, the strengthening storms, the growing droughts, and much more. But it was also to show how the evidence was starting to become apparent everywhere, and that if we didn't take it seriously, our world would change in irrevocable ways, ways that would eventually make parts of the planet uninhabitable. Nowadays, I think it's fair to say that climate change is the most important story of our times, and why it's vital for journalists to be casting light on what's happening and what we need to do to prevent the worst of the consequences. As I explained this morning to students, the math is pretty straightforward and pretty grim. Every year now, we're pumping more than 40 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, and climate scientists estimate we can only afford to add roughly another 315 more gigatons before really bad things start to happen. A gigaton, for what it's worth, is equivalent to 1 billion metric tons. If nothing changes, we're likely to add that amount of CO2 into the atmosphere before the end of this decade, resulting in global average temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. As of now, according to the latest reports by the United Nations, we're on track to an increase of temperatures of nearly 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And just this week, a global agency that monitors the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, found that just last year, we put a record amount of carbon back into the atmosphere. To put some of those abstract numbers in context, today we already have a third more carbon in that atmosphere than at any point in the last 800,000 years, and perhaps as long as 15 million years, depending on the estimate. That's, to be clear, before human beings existed and when oceans were more than 100 feet higher than they are today. The journalist David Wallace Wells, in his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, describes what the difference is between a few degrees of warming and what that will likely mean. At 2 degrees of warming, he writes, the world's major ice sheets will start to collapse. Some 400 million more people will suffer from water scarcity. Major cities along the equator will become too hot or humid to live in, and heat waves will kill thousands of people every summer, even at northern latitudes. At 3 degrees Celsius, extreme droughts will become permanent throughout large parts of the world. Areas burned by wildfires in just the United States will be 6 times larger than they are today. Hunger will increase, crops will fail, rising seas will inundate coastal cities, especially here in Florida. Storms will become far more destructive, especially here in Florida. Conflicts over resources will likely lead to more wars, and ultimately, many more people are likely to die, and as many, as noted, as 1 million species could go extinct. It's worse, much worse than you think, Wallace Wells wrote in his book. Warming of 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius would unleash suffering beyond anything that humans have ever experienced. And just to be clear, these are not distant, abstract threats again. The effects of this warming are already becoming clear in places like New England. In Boston, where I live, last year registered its highest temperatures ever recorded, while 7 of the city's 10 warmest years on record have occurred just since 2010. In the rapidly warming waters off southern New England, the lobster catch, for example, has plummeted by more than 90%. A few years ago, after the iconic cod species fell to about 4% of what was considered a sustainable catch, the federal government did something that was unthinkable. They declared a moratorium on cod fishing. And now, climate change is having a dire impact on North Atlantic right whales, among the most endangered species on the planet. North Atlantic right whales are now estimated to number fewer than 350. And that's even with 15 new calves born just this year. The most immediate threat to their survival is millions of lobster lines that stretch from New England up through Atlantic Canada, as well as vessel strikes. But climate change has served as something of an accelerant to those sources of serious injury and mortality. The Gulf of Maine, for what it's worth, which is the primary body of water just off coastal New England, has been warming faster than just about any other body of water on the planet. Since 2010, the temperature in those waters have been above average in temperature 92% of the time, and at so-called heat wave levels for 55% of the time. That has had a lot of consequences, and among them has been a collapse in the population of Calanus, which is a small rice-sized crustacean that serve as the main source of food for right whales. Studies have found that Calanus colonies have declined by as much as 90% in the Gulf of Maine. As a result, the whales have been migrating north in search of new food sources, making it harder to protect them. In 2017, for example, right whales were recorded for the first time in large numbers in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. That year, 12 of those right whales that were discovered there died, many of them entangled in fishing lines or hit by ships, and primarily because the Canadians had never expected them there and had no significant regulations to protect them. In 2019, a year after that, the Canadians administered quite strict regulations, but there was a backlash. And in 2018, I believe there were only 3 right whales that died, and none of them were in Canadian waters. But the Canadians relaxed those regulations, and the next year, in 2019, 9 of 10 right whales that died in Canadian waters. And the other one, the 10th, which was found dead off the coast of New York, was last seen entangled in fishing gear in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Overall, over the past 5 years, there have been 34 right whales known to have died, and another 16 found to have grievous injuries, or those that are considered swimming while dead. Compounding the tragedy of right whales, in 2018, in something that was unprecedented as long as we've been monitoring them, no calves were born. That has also been attributed in part to climate change. And while there have been, I believe, roughly 47 calves that have been born since 2017, recent studies have found that we're only identifying about 1/3 of all mortalities, meaning far more right whales are dying than we know. This comes as scientists say the right whale population can't sustain more than a single premature death a year. And at the current rate of decline, the whales could go extinct within 20 years. I've written many stories about these issues for the paper, but over the years, newspapers, especially where I work, have become less print publications and more multimedia operations. And this has given me an opportunity to learn how to tell stories in different ways. And without going into the long story that I told this morning about how I came to start making documentary films, I should say that I just found that in this medium, there's a way to communicate that seems to touch people in a visceral way, in a way that that often it seems that my words in print can only hint at. My first environmental film was about how overfishing and climate change led to the collapse of the cod industry in New England, which is America's oldest fishery. It's what sustained the Pilgrims. It's what brought great wealth to the early colonies, and it's what really sustained the country for generations, especially in my region. We called that film Sacred Cod, which was broadcast a few years ago on the Discovery Channel, and I will start off by showing you a clip of that film.
When something's at 3 to 4%, it's time to worry.
We really are one of the fastest warming places on the planet right now.
The Gulf of Maine does not give up her secrets very easily.
There's a lot of things to be learned in this business.
What's one of the most important ones?
Don't trust the government.
I've hung on to a belief
a way of life. I just wanted to give my family a little more than what I had.
Maybe you got to fire some of your employees, just like hundreds of fishermen have been fired.
There was probably 45 people who worked here. Today we have 7.
And this is what science misses on.
So this really becomes a community loss.
The bottoms of these breeding grounds have become virtual deserts.
There's no more cod on Cape Cod.
The last Iceman of Gloucester.
Levels are pretty high.
From the wharfs to the fish dealers to the truckers to the supermarkets to our churches that are friggin' empty now.
It's the death of a way of life.
After making that film, I was asked by the University of Miami to return to Florida to make a film about the federal government's $16 billion effort to restore the Everglades, which is probably one of the planet's most damaged ecosystems, as well as report and include in the film the impacts of rising seas. We called that film Gladesmen, the Last of the Sawgrass Cowboys. I have a clip of that, but in the interest of time, I think I'll skip over that. After that, I made a film titled Lobster War, which was about how the warming waters in the Gulf of Maine led to a surge in the lobster catch in a patch of water known as the Gray Zone, which is between down east Maine and Nova Scotia. Both the United States and Canada have claimed those waters since the end of the Revolutionary War. The rising catch there led to a conflict between fishermen in both countries, and I'll show you this one. I'll show you a clip from this one.
A fisherman is born, not made. This is a different world. For the fisherman who visits it regularly, it's a morning world, a familiar book with chapters still to come. His traps, his hopes, his investment, all lie 20 fathoms deep on rocky bottom off the coast of Maine. There's a good living to be made in the Atlantic Ocean if anybody will go and get it.
There's a patch of water around Machias Seal Island that's in contention between Canada and the United States.
The northern Gulf of Maine has suddenly become optimal for lobster. Our population here has exploded. One of the most valuable fisheries that's ever existed.
Suddenly you had Maine and Canadian fishermen in these waters at the same time, jousting for position.
And tensions are high, violence is bound to happen.
This is the last land border dispute between Canada and the United States. It could be magnified to the point where there could be costs that would be significant to both countries. Border disputes don't go away, they just fester. Something's going to happen.
In some ways, lobstering is immensely complex. In another sense, it is simple and direct. The sea and the boat remain the ruling force in a saltwater man's life, and the quest of fish, the thing that brings not only the rewards of toil, but a sense of freedom.
After spending a lot of time on the water with lobstermen, I came to learn about their impact on North Atlantic right whales and other marine mammals. And that led me to start thinking about how I might make sense of that chilling United Nations report that estimated we were likely to lose 1 million species by the end of the century. I began to think that it might be easier for people to comprehend such a huge loss if I could tell the story through one species, an iconic one, and as we discussed this morning, a charismatic megafauna that people might more easily identify with. So that led me to make my most recent film, which is called Entangled. That film chronicles the efforts to protect North Atlantic right whales from extinction the impacts of those efforts on the lobster industry, and how the regulatory agency overseeing both the National Marine Fisheries Service has struggled and arguably failed to balance the vying interests. And I'll show you that one. That looks like the end, by the way, Andrew. You might have to.
right whale is an extraordinary creature. It's really one of the wonders of the living world. But if something in our management doesn't change, the direction of the population points to zero, and that's extinction.
The North Atlantic right whale is considered one of the most endangered species on the planet.
This would be the first large whale in modern history that would go extinct.
Eighty-5% of the right whale population now bears scars that indicate entanglement injury. This was a big problem, and it's an urgent problem.
It's a tragedy that we're losing the right whales. It's emblematic of large-scale changes that are happening on the planet.
Human beings can exist without biodiversity, and this is maybe a harbinger of where we're going.
We need to put as much pressure as we can on the agency to step up and take action right now.
I don't think the urgency can be overstated. Human action is killing these whales, and human action has the ability to save them.
Lobstermen are stewards of the sea, and they don't want to entangle anything.
I sat here and listened to environmentalist after environmentalist tell me what a murderous individual I am.
My opinion about the whales is fuck them. What more can we do? Eventually, they're going to die off. It's going to happen no matter what.
As your governor, I will do everything I can to defend Maine's lobster industry in the face of this absurd federal overreach.
The challenge is to find ways for the fishing industry and the right whales to coexist in the same waters.
NOAA is the fox guarding the chicken coop. You're going to be fired for being a liar and a person who works to kill off the right whale.
One of the problems is that fisheries are one of the main factors that are endangering protected species. You end up with one organisation deeply conflicted with its mission.
So I hope it looks a little better from there than it does from here, but it's painful for me to look at because it's not, the colors are a little crazy on the screen, and the sound's all off. But so now I'm working on a few new films, and I'm continuing to work at the paper. We now have a climate team at the Globe. I've been waving a kind of lonely flag for years at the paper, covering climate change, and now we have a dedicated team. We have 2 other reporters and an editor, all of whom every day are working on trying to tell stories about climate change. And if we have time afterward, I'll sort of maybe hold this to the very end. I brought the sizzle for my latest film, which is actually a very different kind of film. It happens to fuse my interests in lobster and whales, but it's more of a portrait. And in short, it's a story about a man who, a lobster diver, someone who does something that just about nobody else does in one of the most dangerous places to do it. He dives for lobster off Provincetown, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, where in recent years, also to some extent, in part because of climate change. There have been a huge increase in the number of great white sharks, and something very unexpected happened to him, and I'll leave it at that. So I guess we'll call everybody up, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
It's time to work. First of all, audience, get your questions ready. We'll answer questions, but first we have Professor Ed McGinley, Terry Cerrone, and students Savannah Paget and Leslie Palmer, who are going to ask the first 2 rounds or so of questions for David. So, Terry, why don't you start?
Okay. Thank you. That was amazing. I am Dr. Terry Cerrone. I started at Flagler College in the fall of 2007. I've been in Florida actually for most of my life. I did grow up in Connecticut, but I did most of my graduate work right here in St. Augustine at the Whitney Lab. I really developed a love for genetics and molecular biology, so I was able to marry my passion for marine biology, so studying the really big stuff, with the ability to be able to then study the really small molecules as well. So it's been really exciting to come to Flagler College and to bring that background with me. The courses that we've developed at Flagler College then range the whole gamut of biology. So again, the charismatic marine megafauna, all the way down to the genetics and the biotechnology courses as well.
So you have a question?
Oh, I was going to let everyone introduce. I wasn't ready yet.
Why don't we? Okay. Well, I think we should get underway with the questions. Okay. If we
Sure.
do that, so go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Well, one of the questions I guess that I have for you, one of the things that really stuck out when you were talking about these numbers. I know I have found in my teaching that sometimes it's really hard to explain that a species is really struggling when you give numbers, because there's no baseline. Most people don't have any idea. You know, at 300 and 400, maybe that sounds like a big number, and there's really this idea of shifting baselines. Where do we start? What is a bad number? And so I've thought about that a lot, and what always sort of came up was this idea that these animals are wild, right? They're supposed to be wild, meaning that we really shouldn't know exactly how many we have of these individuals, right? And once we start really knowing exactly how many are born each year, that's a really good sign that something is probably in trouble. So how do you reconcile kind of explaining to people the issues when even just the numbers are really hard to wrap your brain around?
It's a good question, and so in the film and in other circumstances, particularly in the paper, what I usually try to explain is the percentage decline. So with North Atlantic right whales, we've seen roughly a 30% decline from their peak, which was like 2009. And just in the past decade, we've seen this steep decline in their population. I do think, though, that when you talk about specific numbers like 300, in fact, I think, Jim, you might remember the number, but the last estimate for the population, when I first started making the film, which was in 2019, there were estimated to be 411 North Atlantic right whales. As we were making the film, the number dropped to like 368, and then the most recent estimate was something like 335 or something like that. Jim might know.
The other Jim.
Yeah.
The most recent number that I've heard is 366. 336.
366 was a year before. Yeah. So 336 is roughly the most recent estimate. That doesn't account for the 15 calves that were born in the past year, but it also doesn't account for the unknown mortalities that we've had. So you know, it's safe to say that there are probably fewer than 350 whales. And I do think it's a good question how to convey that so people understand that that's a pretty significantly small number. And just two other data points. One is that we have seen with right whales fewer than 100 breeding females left. I think the number is now down to like under 90. And maybe Jim knows what the better number is, but that is frightening because when there are no longer breeding females, you have functional extinction, and that's what everybody's afraid of. And the other data point worth noting is that before whaling, before we really decimated the right whale population, there were more than there were an estimated 20,000 North Atlantic right whales. That number is somewhat fungible. We don't really know that, and I've heard various folks raise questions about that number, but I think that's the best number that I've heard, and we include that figure in the film. So that just gives you a sense of the rapid decline. But I think it's enough, and I try to point this out every time I write about right whales in the paper, that we've seen just in the past decade a decline of nearly a third of the population. That alone, I think, is pretty stark.
Leslie, why don't you introduce yourself, say where you're from, say what your year is and your major, and then ask your question.
I will. Okay. Hi, I'm Leslie Palmer. I'm originally from Northeast Pennsylvania, but I moved down here about 2.5 years ago to begin my education here at Flagler, so now I'm a sophomore. I'm a coastal environmental science student, and I currently am researching a lot with Dr. McGinley here, and I have gotten so involved, and obviously to a point where I couldn't have imagined myself as a sophomore, but enough of the sappy stuff. My question really is, and this is bouncing mostly off of yours, Dr. Saran, is I know I like numbers too, and when it comes to conserving a target species, it's been found that typically causes more problems. However, targeting such a broader issue like climate change, that ultimately creates a domino effect, and therefore the right whales, manatees, all of our favorite creatures, their populations sort of would fall back into place. And so when it comes to the numbers, and you as a communicator of science, which is increasingly important with this political divide that we are suffering with in this nation, how do you get people who are not familiar with scientific rhetoric to care? I mean, when we talk about, a global temperature rise of 2 Celsius, we know that that's destructive. We can't have that. But to somebody who isn't familiar with these, with this language, 2, that doesn't sound like much at all, especially if they don't know the metric system, especially in America. As a random person, I personally would say, okay, I don't care.
That's a great question, thank you. So it's, number one, a challenge. And I think climate change arguably is one of the most difficult issues for us as a society, as local, state, and federal governments to address, because it doesn't always seem like it's happening right now, or that it seems like it's a threat that will occur in 2100 or something. But what I try to do with these films, with my work as a reporter, is to make it clear that this isn't abstract, that 2 degrees Celsius, which we've already passed in Massachusetts, which I just wrote about, is warming at a faster rate than just about any other part of the world for some reason. We are seeing severe impacts. And so the films that I made about the collapse of the cod fishery, we had overfishing of cod stocks for generations, but the cod bounced back. It wasn't until that the temperatures of the water started to spike that we saw the population not be able to recover. And that put hundreds of people out of work. And there was a lot of devastation. We've seen that with the lobster fishery. We've seen that with the winter shrimp fishery. We've seen that with a bunch of other fisheries. And part of the reason why I focus and have focused on the oceans is because the oceans are arguably experiencing the impact of climate change more rapidly than anywhere else, as our oceans absorb the vast majority of the carbon dioxide that we emit. And that carbon dioxide is causing causing our oceans to lose oxygen, and we have these places called, what are they called, dead spots, where everything that's in that area essentially dies because there isn't sufficient oxygen in the water. And it's created all kinds of changes in ecosystems. So, and we're seeing it, so one of the other films that I'm working on now is about sea level rise. And the film Gladesman reflects how sea level rise is likely to impact the Everglades. And if we have saltwater infusion in the Everglades, which is the primary source of drinking water, which is I think the main source of drinking water, or the only source of drinking water for most of South Florida, if that becomes saltwater, which could happen, millions of people from Palm Beach County to Miami-Dade County will not have fresh drinking water. So this isn't a distant, abstract thing. This is something that's happening. And my effort is to try to communicate that in a way that that doesn't use hyperbole, that tries to avoid unnecessarily apocalyptic language, but frankly, the language, we've reached a point where we are talking about apocalyptic situations, and so that's what the language calls for. And if that's what it calls for, that's the language I'll try to use.
Savannah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Savannah Paget. I'm a senior coastal environmental science major here at Flagler College. I am interning for the second year at the Alligator Farm over on the island, working with their rookery crew. And then I've also been doing research with Dr. McGinley here, looking at phytoplankton biodiversity and the impacts of marine biofouling on those species. My specific question was, so another one of the research experiences I've been fortunate enough to involve myself in here is with Dr. Saran there, and we took a dolphin biology course this past semester. We spent countless hours out in the marina, salt run, all around in the water. Offshore, we went a couple miles offshore sometimes, just days on end, observing bottlenose dolphins. And we had countless discussions about all the different various impacts on these dolphins, from human impacts to natural impacts, but specifically something that struck me, and this question I raised in that class, was the influence of the pandemic on these species. And I found an article then that I cited in my project for that course that basically there's not a ton of research yet. They're starting to make the statistics, but there are copious amounts of boats, people traveling out into the water, because when the pandemic hit and everybody was stuck in their houses and quarantining and everything, one of the easiest outlets was to get outside and go get on a boat where there were less restrictions, because the odds were someone wasn't going to tell you to put a mask on if you're out on a boat with your family. So a lot of people took that route to escape. And I just am curious, I was curious then as to the impact that had on bottlenose dolphins and boat strikes. And I mean, some people know and some don't that there's not a speed limit in the marina right here. So going off of that, I'm curious, in your experience in the field, in what ways has the pandemic exacerbated the impacts of climate change, specifically on those species?
It's an interesting question. I would say, the impact of vessel traffic, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, was the opposite, I would say, of what you're talking about. I think that there was a period of time, in fact, one of the scientist that we interview in the film, toward the end of the film, who studies the impacts of sounds on, or ship traffic, vessel traffic, noise on marine mammals, did a study that looked at the impact or the stress levels or the hormone levels of a certain species, I think of whales, during the shutdown that occurred after September 11th. So after the attacks on September 11th, there was in a similar way that occurred during the pandemic, there was a quick clampdown and there was a tremendous stop in ship traffic. And apparently, stress levels for whales and other marine mammals declined substantially based on their studies. And my understanding is that we saw, at least in the first few months of the pandemic, a similar decline in stress levels and a similar decline in ship traffic, at least major commercial ship traffic. I'm sure recreational ship traffic in places like Florida, not so much where I live, at least in the vast desert of winter. It's not a lot of people are getting to escape on boats, but they do in the summer. And so that is a serious problem. And there are all kinds of, I can't speak to the impact of the pandemic, but I can say that there have been recent studies looking at the impacts of ships violating speed rules. And NOAA, the agency that oversees these issues, has had to clamp down a little bit. And arguably, according to these reports that I've read, hasn't done enough to try to reduce or get vessels to comply with voluntary or obligatory, depending on the area, speed limits. And that is potentially really problematic and dangerous for whales. And we saw down here, actually, and Jim, who is my local expert here, I'm just the journalist, so I don't have all these facts and figures at my command, but there was a vessel that struck a boat, there was a vessel that struck a calf last year, I believe, and killed the calf. And there was just a big report about that that NOAA released. And I'm not sure exactly what the consequences were for the captain of that vessel, but we could talk more about that afterward.
Professor?
Thank you, David, for coming and giving this wonderful presentation and being available to our campus community, so I do appreciate that. My name is Dr. Ed McGinley. I'm an associate professor here in the Natural Sciences Department. My background is in fisheries. I've been here about 10 years now. One of my passions here is involving students in undergraduate research, so you see 2 students that I've worked with among countless others. And being very careful to kind of balance on this edge to not offend anyone in the audience. We're seeing, if we look out at our audience, a certain demographic versus the students at the college. David, do you see or do you have an idea when you are writing, is that, I can look at myself, I can look at my parents, I've done things a certain way for so long that change for me is kind of more difficult, whereas maybe reaching out to younger generations, they are maybe more apt to mobilize via social media, via whatever platform it might be. Do you see some kind of more return on your investment reaching out to different demographics in regards to issues like climate change?
It's an interesting question. I would say my experience is that a lot of older folks are really engaged on this issue. And I have really been heartened, and I know the environmental activist, author, and otherwise journalist extraordinaire Bill McKibben just started a movement for, I think, older than 65-year-olds to get involved in climate change activism. And I have really seen a lot of impressive activism on the part of older folks. That said, I love whenever I have an opportunity to come to universities or even high schools and talk to students, because I think that, you know, it's their future. You know, I think folks my generation and older are, you know, we're seeing climate change, but we're not likely to see it in the way Savannah and Leslie are going to experience it, and also your kids and my kids. And it's not good what is on the horizon if we don't act. And that means cutting emissions now and quickly, and stopping continued use of fossil fuels. It's just that simple. And this is not an advocate talking. I'm not taking any, you know, this is not an opinion. This is a basic fact. If we are going to avert the worst consequences of climate change, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to stop building more fossil fuel infrastructure, and we need to move quickly to find other alternative forms of energy. And if we don't, it's not going to be good. And so I relish the possibility to come to a place like Flagler College to talk to students, and it was a really wonderful opportunity this morning to talk to a lot of really great students like you guys, to hear how engaged and smart they are. So, so thanks for that opportunity.
Let's do another round of questions, and then we'll open it up. Now, I hope you're getting your questions ready in the audience, and Anna is collecting them, and I'll read them off, and we'll proceed. Okay.
You mentioned the whale being a large, charismatic megafauna, right? And
that's been a recurring theme today.
And it is obviously much easier to try to get people's attention and really try to get them caring about those sorts of organisms, unlike something like the insects. When we talk about losing all of these species, people don't realize how many insects we're losing. But actually in Florida, I think everybody can remember, if you lived here even 10 years ago, you were at the gas station washing your windshield. I mean, you could not drive very far without having to actually clear your windshield, wash your car. When's the last time we all washed our cars? Those insects, they're just not here anymore. And that is such a stark realization, so that when we're talking about these loss of species, that's a sort of a great way to do that. So they're not the large, charismatic megafauna, but it's something that everybody can really experience. So I'm wondering if you think that having a whale, I mean, is that what it's gonna take to really wake up a lot of people, that we're gonna have to lose a whale, not 100 different insects, to really get that feeling?
It's a great question as well, and we talked about that a little bit this morning. In short, you know, I think one of the people in the film says, and this is I mentioned this morning, one of the lines that really resonated with me: if you can't save a great whale, what can you save? And that is a perfect summation of why I wanted to make that film. And so, yes, the million species are going to include insects, and what Ed raised this morning was the acid-spitting cockroach. You know, that people aren't going to really feel that fondness for, but each creature, you know, has a important role in our ecosystem, and when we lose them, we lose something that we don't know what the impacts might be.
For young scientists like Savannah and I, sometimes, I mean, we love our studies and we love our classes and everything we learn, you know, we're always around people who agree, and it's nice, you know, but as soon as you step on Facebook, it's horrifying. I find it a little difficult sometimes to control my thumbs and shut myself up. But when it comes to science communication for she and I, or students that we're acquainted with and our colleagues, and in our own writing in the future, or even now in our own manuscripts, what tactic would you advise us to use when it comes to saying what we want in a way that is not flammable, you know?
I get this question a lot, and it's an important question. It's a question I struggle with as well. I think our knee-jerk tendency is to respond with the similar kind of language that might be directed to us, and I, as you can imagine, I get a lot of vitriol in my inbox. You know, it's everything from I think I mentioned today a fisherman who wasn't happy with the title of Entangled, who said he was using his ropes to ready a noose for me. You know, there are a lot of awful things. The vast majority, though, is more like claptrap and talking points. And what I try to do is I try to set the table when I'm talking to people. And first, I want them to understand that they're directing their vitriol at an actual human being, a person with feelings, a person who has children, a person who cares about the world, who's not like their enemy, who is a fellow American. And my hope is that if you can lower the temperature and you can maybe reach across our ideological divide, then maybe you can have a conversation. And then if I can get through on that level, then I might point them to, like, well, okay, you might not think that climate change is for real, but this is what NASA says. And I might point them to the actual link. Or you might think sea level rise is a myth or a hoax, as our former president would say. But here's the actual graphic from satellite data. So, okay, and they might not believe that, but I try to carry on the conversation in a civil, thoughtful way. And ultimately, what I try to do is make films that try to do that. So Gladesman, Lobster War, and Entangled, all are films that try to reach across that divide by showing, hopefully, empathy for people and allowing people who might never be interested in watching an environmental film into that film, so that maybe they'll see the other side of things. And on the flip side, my hope is that folks who make environmental regulations, folks who understand that we need to take action, recognize that those regulations and those actions have consequences. And they can sometimes be really harmful to communities, to people, to heritages. And the way we design that has to be mindful of those consequences.
So we discussed earlier and during this discussion how to approach opposers of climate change whose reasoning is that they either don't believe it's going to happen for religious reasons, for fear, for lack of knowledge, whatever the case may be. I'm curious as to how you approach those who have the attitude, and there was a quote said in the film that was one of the most chilling things I heard in both discussions. But when talking about the whales, it was one of the fishermen, and he said, blank whales, it's going to happen anyway. And
Fuck
so,
the whales, she wanted to say.
I'm like, my professors are right here.
It was fuck whales.
Thank you, Dr. McGinley. So how do you approach someone who is not only aware that it is going to happen, that we are losing these whales, that the climate is changing, not just negatively, but at a rate we've never seen before, but they don't care, knowing those things. It's not just that they're not sure or they don't quite believe it. They know it and they don't care.
Well, it's interesting that you asked me this question because I had asked Savannah this question earlier because we were talking about her family and how she grew up, and I was asking her how she has these kinds of conversations with her family, and I think the answer is similar to what you do, which is, you hopefully get them to recognize, look, it's me, it's your daughter, it's your granddaughter, it's Savannah. Like, I'm the kid who's making it, who's trying, and you can't just dismiss what I'm saying. And the relevance to that is, hopefully, we're not gonna make it as a society, we're not gonna make it as a country, we're not gonna make it, as a planet, if we can't communicate, if it's all vitriol all the time, if it's talking points, if it's ideology, if facts don't matter, then we have no reservoir of understanding or common ground. And I think that you can't stop trying to have that conversation. And even with folks who say F the whales, they might, have some way to communicate with them. And I think it's important for those of us who care about things like the future of our planet, the future of a charismatic megafauna, that we try.
Find our inner Lorax.
There you go.
So this is a question maybe more on a personal level for you, David. Decades from now, when your biographer is sitting down with you and writing the book of David Abel and says to you, what is the main theme? What are you most proud of that you really want emphasized in this book? How would you answer that?
I have no idea. Hopefully that I've raised children who don't become terrorists, that hopefully, right, that hopefully, I raised decent, loving, humane kids who care about themselves, care about their relatives, and care about their fellow citizens to try to make this a better place, to make this a better place for all of us to live in, where we get along and we don't pollute our only home.
Okay, we do have questions from the audience. I want to thank you for that, and a shout out for the Marineland Right Whale Club group, whatever they are, who took a night off from the high seas to spend the time with us. Thank you. Quite good question. Have you seen an increase in the disregard or disdain for science in general by the public?
Well, I think the 4 years of the prior administration did everything that it could to try to discredit and dismantle our federal agencies that oversee our research and development and science, and also, basic ideas like, we shouldn't pollute our planet, and whether it's climate change or a pandemic, I think, the answer to that is yes, so I'll try to keep my answers brief.
Good. Next question. How do we reconcile the possible extinction of the right whale and the livelihoods of the places like Maine? Or the island.
I didn't get that whole thing. So
how do we reconcile, it's a conflict that you basically have pointed out here, how do we reconcile the distinction or the extinction of the right whale with the livelihoods of places like the people who are working off of Maine?
it's a good question,
Yeah.
and the film tries to address that. So I encourage you all to find the film and watch the film. But unlike a lot of really difficult, intractable problems, there are solutions to this problem. And that is, as we discussed the other night, there are new forms of fishing called ropeless fishing, which allows for us to avoid using the primary source of entanglement, which is the vertical buoy line. It's the lines that connect the traps from the buoys at the surface to the traps at the sea floor. And this technology has come quite a ways in recent years. There are lobstermen who are experimenting with this, using it regularly, and it seems like we're on the path over the next decade to hopefully transition our fishery with federal assistance and subsidies to eliminate the use of vertical buoy lines that are the primary source of death and serious injury to right whales, humpback whales, gray whales, finback whales, loggerhead turtles, and other marine mammals. And that is a solution that can make a difference.
So that leads into another good question. How do we convert the people, the fishermen, to start using some of these tools?
That is going to be more challenging, and I just wrote a story about this for the Globe, about this group of fishermen who have proposed to state regulators in Massachusetts that they be allowed to fish in closed areas using ropeless fishing. And there was something of, and I know this is probably not the right word, an insurrection against this effort by their fellow lobstermen who in public meetings have decried their efforts, calling them traitors and selfish and all kinds of horrendous, the kind of language that we're talking about. And I believe the noose reference to me came after that story was published a few weeks ago.
So we're left with what's the call to action? Starting with recycling on the Flagler campus, Mr. Dean.
Yeah, I think recycling on this campus is a good first step. Several people have remarked to me today about how there's no recycling here. Recycling is a challenging issue that is a separate discussion.
It cost me my
but
job,
it would be
by the
nice
way.
to have recycling widely available. Call to actions are very weird as a journalist. I'm not, an advocate, so I'm not going to be leading a charge. But I would just say that, these are real problems, and it's up to everyone to understand the facts and the science and share that with other people in a civil and thoughtful way as you possibly can without getting angry or flustered or responding in the knee-jerk fashion that people might respond to you.
And that, in fact, is the call to action. Just basically make the effort to become aware of these issues because there's plenty of information around. And thanks to David Abel for talking about it and for writing about it and for showing us pictures of it. It's just been it's been a great day for all of us in David Abel's trail today. But you've all contributed to it. Thank you so much for coming out. I do have for David the famous Flagler lion.
All right. Thank you. That's awesome.
It's heavy enough to knock out any of the surviving right whales. So we'll. Anyway, thank you very, very much for coming.
Before everybody goes, if you want to see the sizzle to my new film, if there's time,
yes, don't leave.
I'll share that with you.
You're missing a very, very good.
This is. Sizzle. I don't know how it's going to look on the screen, but You can, if Andrew's still up there and he wants to hit
Andrew's
in
running.
well, I won't say it, but
He's up there.
you'll hopefully get a sense of what this story is about.
I think you can see over us, I think. There we go.
He's all by himself in the mystery world. He doesn't have to deal with anybody. He doesn't have to be nice or bad or anything, and he's down there with the fish. He's a hunter. He's part of it without having to deal with humanity.
When I was 10, a lot of stuff happened. Losing my dad and my brother and moving all in the same year. And it was just my mom and me. Tiny little town on the tip of Cape Cod. I got picked on and didn't fit in. But as soon as I moved here, I picked up the fishing, and that was it. My poor mom.
He just doesn't play it safe.
If something happens, there's no one to help him.
He's going to keep doing it. He'll keep doing it till he dies. There's no other way for him to live.
It's way more than money for me. It's my peaceful place. It's my hunter-gatherer primal place.
911, what's your emergency?
We have an injury on a fishing boat.
What's the injury?
Got a up leg.
Okay, so
Like they're up.
just keep him
Keep him out of shock. Yep.
Yeah. Did he fall?
No, it was underwater. Yeah, it's a long story.
Do you know, did you see him hurt his leg or did
The diver, he was.
do you know how he hurt his leg?
No, he was attacked by.
We begin with breaking news and what could be the story of the year.
It's a biblical story.
This is unbelievable.
It's one of the greatest stories I have ever heard in my life. I'm crying.
I remember thinking, could this possibly be true?
All the way from Provincetown, Massachusetts, please welcome Captain Michael Packard.
Michael Packard came home from the hospital with one incredible story to tell. He was lobster diving off the coast of Provincetown when the world around him suddenly blacked out.
His crewmate couldn't believe what he was watching.
He actually was in there trying to figure out what the to do.
The sea has saved his life, but is also the most dangerous thing in his life.
I'll tell you, I will never forget that sight as long as I live.
I said, what you think about Michael? He said, Mom, I thought it was over.
All of a sudden, he let me go, and I started crying because I was so thankful that I escaped death yet again.